Welcome back to Macroeconomics. If you like the content of our videos, you can support us by subscribing to our channel and following us on social media platforms. In this video, I'll be discussing the first chapter of the Oliver Blanchard, that is a tour of the world. The goal of this chapter is to give you a sense of events and some of the macroeconomic issues confronting different countries today. We'll be starting off with an overview of two key events of crisis, that is the pandemic of 2020 and the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 that hit the world economy in the 21st century, and then shift our focus to three main economic powers of the world, that is the United States, the Euro area, and the China. Finally, we'll be concluding with the way forward. And broadly, if I have to emphasize on something which we should take away from this chapter, is the basic message that economies, like people we study in microeconomics, they get sick, like we experience the episodes of high unemployment, recessions, financial crises, low growth, etc. Macroeconomics is also about why it happens. We try to understand, get answer to these questions, to these events, that what could be the underlying reasons or the underpinnings to these events and what can be done about it. So this is all about the first chapter which we are going to discuss further. The first event which we are going to discuss is the pandemic of 2020, that is the COVID-19. This pandemic has induced a serious recession from the day it originated in Wuhan province of China. Now, to narrowly define what are recessions, they are basically a consequence of imbalances which are accumulated over years by economies. And these events or imbalances which are accumulated, they are more of unsustainable, you can say. That's why they lead to turbulence or turmoil in an economy. The key examples for the same could be overinvestment in the real estate, which originated in 1920s, leading to the Great Depression, right? And more recently, the global financial crisis of 2008, okay? The recessions which were induced during that period, or say for instance, in 2001, the dot-com bubble on the Wall Street. Now, these are all US specific origins which have been listed here, but if you see across countries, we'll get n number of examples for such episodes of unsustainable environment in an economy. Now, the length of recession is determined by its determinants, okay, the underlying factors. Now, it is the underlying factors which basically determine when the economy will be coming out or recovering from a particular recession. For instance, the Great Depression of 1929, it lasted for approximately 43 months, while the global financial crisis of 2007-8 lasted for approximately 1.5 years, that is 18 months. Now, in the current case, the pandemic-based recession is completely different. How? It is different in a sense that it is an exogenous and unexpected shock. What does that mean? Is that it is not something which is directly being induced from the instruments which an economy is working with within the system. Okay, it is something which is unprecedented, unforeseen, and comes in to your economy and creates turmoil. Okay, and as a consequence, because the underlying determinant here is completely different, not like the one which we had during the Great Recession of 1929 or 2007-8, where mostly it was from the banking sector or the financial sector. So here, obviously, the tools which we need to address this recession will be different. The policy approach is going to be different, and the length of the cycle, business cycle, or this recession, when it gets over, is also going to vary. This figure summarizes the duration of US recessions since 1900, and broadly it has been classified under pre-war period and the post-World War II period. As I mentioned that this pandemic is different from the earlier episodes of financial crisis or recessions which were witnessed by the world economies. Now let us try to understand that how pandemic like shock, which is more of an exogenous shock coming from outside the system, okay, if the system is an economy, so how does that affects an economy? First of all, the production chains of an economy are broken. Now, what does that mean? For example, companies which were using intermediate goods from China because the virus had its origin in China. Now, the companies which were importing raw materials or capital goods or whatever intermediate goods they were using in their production chains, now that supply disruption was there, okay, and they were not able to source those inputs due to frequent lockdowns and stalled transportation, etc., right? And this led to the breakdown in the production chains, and as a consequence what happens is that your business activity stops. Now we know that when the business activity is going to stop, obviously the avenues for growth or employment are also going to get affected, right? Another consequence of this pandemic induced recession was the limited mobility. Now, because we have lockdowns in place during that time, what was happening is all those who cannot work remotely stopped working. Okay, this was again one of the key consequences. Though people switched to the online medium, remote working was the way forward and has been going on even today, but limited mobility resulted in rendering many unemployed as well. Now, intermediate goods and workers are essential factors of production, without which businesses experience a supply shock, right? So, a supply shock was induced because of this pandemic as well. In addition to the supply shock, the increased unemployment, the demand shock, and the slowdown in consumption was also one of the key consequences. So this pandemic was a double-edged sword in a sense that it's not only either demand side or either supply side shock, it had a mix of both. Now supply shock has been accompanied by a demand shock in this case, which further led to the fall in consumption. Now basic national income accounting says that our national income is a function of consumption, investment, net export, government expenditure broadly, right? So what happened is, because as the unemployment increased with the business activity going down, there was a demand shock, and when the demand shock is going to be there, obviously because people don't have anything to spend in their pockets because of increased unemployment, right? So obviously there will be less consumption demand as well. So this is how this chain of reaction was taking place. The following figures summarize the severity of these pandemic induced shocks to an economy. Now, for instance, in this figure, the number of subway users declined drastically since March 2020. Also, the unemployment numbers, if we see, they are increasing exponentially January 2020 onwards. So, which again implies the loss of human capital in an economy. As we had mentioned the impact of the pandemic on consumption, so this figure summarizes the impact on the expenditure of the Spanish nationals vis-a-vis year-on-year growth rate. Now, the IMF estimates of the quarterly GDP growth rates in both advanced and emerging economies, as well as the developing economies, indicate a steep decline since quarter 2 of 2020. Now, in terms of the global commodity markets, the crude oil prices and the gasoline prices have been crashing to record low levels ever since the pandemic came in. Another major economic crisis experienced by the world economy is the crisis of 2008-9, famously known as the Global Financial Crisis or GFC, which had its origin in US, and later on it transmitted to rest of the world as well. The figure also shows there has been a steep decline in the growth rates of the emerging as well as the advanced economies during the period of 2007 and 8. I'll be giving a brief account of how this crisis translated to rest of the world and became a global financial crisis. But for detailed account, I'll be sharing across few links in the description below, which you can visit and get to know how different events shaped across different economies the outcomes which were there as a consequence of this financial crisis. And interestingly, for India or for any other major emerging market economy like Brazil, it had severe implications through different channels. So, how did this crisis unfold to rest of the world? In 2007, there were signs of expansion taking place across the world in terms of the output growth. The average world output growth was around 4.5%, with advanced economies growing at 2.7% per year and emerging and developing economies growing around 6.6% per year. Now in 2007, what happened is that there were few signs which were pointing towards the fact that there may be an end coming towards the expansion phase of these economies. Now, particularly in USA, what happened is that the housing prices had doubled since 2000. Okay, they had started to decline now. This decline in housing prices create a worry across the economists, and there were many who were actually optimistic about this taking place and posited that it may lead to lower spending by consumers, lower cost of construction, and scope for the Federal Reserve Bank of US to lower down the interest rates and stimulate demand and avoid the recession. But there was a group which was pessimistic about it, and they believed that this decline in interest rate may not be enough to sustain the demand which was declining, and the United States was required more of into devise other measures so that it does not end up in a recession. What happened later is that there was a further decline in the housing prices. So the prices continued to go down. Okay, and this indicated that there were problems which were much more deeper than what was being assessed at that point of time by different think tanks or policy practitioners. Now, many of the mortgages that had been sold during the previous expansion period were of poor quality, okay, like the credit rating we talk about. Now, many of the borrowers had taken too big loans in terms of the size or the quantum of the loan and were increasingly unable to make the monthly repayment or the installment which they were supposed to. And as a consequence, what happened is that there were episodes of frequent defaults taking place. All right, and people also had an incentive to default, okay, because the value of their mortgage was often more than the price of the house itself. So this was not the worst of it. What happened is that the banks that had issued the mortgages had often bundled and packaged them together with new securities, okay, what we call as mortgage backed securities, okay, and then sold these securities to other banks and investors. So if one entity is failing to repay back, the others are also going to suffer, okay. So these securities had often been repackaged into new securities and so on, and the result is that many banks, instead of holding that mortgage themselves, held these securities which were so complex that their value was nearly impossible to assess. So it was more of a bubble which was there, and it was at the verge of getting burst. And eventually what happened was that what followed on 15 September 2008, a major bank, that is the, went bankrupt. Okay, so when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, what happened is the dramatic turn of events. Okay, the effects were really dramatic because the links between Lehman and other banks were so opaque. Many other banks appeared at the risk of going bankrupt as well as a consequence of that. Now, for weeks, it looked as if the whole financial system might collapse. So this was the severity of the crisis which was taking place at that point of time. Okay, and then eventually what happened is that this crisis turned into a major economic crisis. The stock markets, they collapsed as highlighted in this figure, where the stock market indices of the United States, the euro area, and the emerging market economies from the beginning of 2007-8 to the end of 2010-11, you can see that there has been a steep decline and then followed a recovery. As mentioned earlier, the impact of the crisis was not limited only to US, as the US banks were grappling with the shortage of funds, so they repatriated funds from other countries, which created problem in the banks of other countries. Okay, and eventually what happened is that those banks which got into trouble, their lending also came to halt, which further implied that it will lead to decline in the spending or expenditure, and as a consequence the decline in output, that is their growth, also fell down. Also in several European countries, what happened was that the governments already had accumulated huge amount of debt. Now when their debt levels were high, this problem further widened their deficits. Now investors were seeking high interest rates, the government reduced deficits in a scenario of high interest rates and the worried investors by combination of lower spending and higher taxes. And this further led to decrease in demand and the output. Now in Europe, the decline in output was so bad that this aspect of the crisis acquired its own name, that is the Euro crisis. In short, the US recession, it turned into a world recession, and by 2009, average growth in advanced economies was clocking around minus 3.4%. By far, it was the lowest growth rate since Great Depression. Now, growth in emerging and developing economies remained positive, but was 3.5 percentage points lower than that in 2007-8 average. Lehman Brothers. So the next point of discussion which we now turn to is comparing the financial crisis of 2008-9 with that of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is important because it provides an insight to comprehend the policy response that eventually saved the world. Now, if we look at the 2008-2009 crisis, it was relatively small financial shock as the impact of balance sheets was modest. Approximately 30% decline in the housing prices was there. So it was more of a sector specific crisis. Okay, while on the contrary, if we look at the current ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, it's completely having a different origin, okay, which led the world economies to a standstill situation, especially during the episodes of lockdowns. Also, there was no direct impact on the balance sheets of the banks, like in case of 2008-9 financial crisis. Banks suffered a lot, okay, and there were episodes of bank runs, bank failures, etc. On the contrary, if we look at the 2008-9 financial crisis, it was prolonged because repairing those balance sheets took time, okay. But if we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, income and credit support, which was given in tranches by both fiscal and monetary authorities, was a different approach, okay, as compared to that of the crisis, because the situation and the origins were fundamentally different. Further, this pandemic has accounted for greater healthcare intervention, while in the contrary, it was not even required, right? So the response from the policy to both these crises, which basically translated into global financial crisis as well, it has been different because the underlying origins have been different. So it's very important to understand the nature of a financial crisis and then devise a suitable response to address the issues which are confronted with. We now move to the discussion which is country specific. First of all, we'll be taking up advanced economies, and then we'll be talking about the emerging market economies. So when we are looking at country specific assessment, broadly there are two questions which economists, when they are trying to look at a country, they ask. Number one, how big is country from an economic point of view, and which is what we get to know through their GDP numbers, that is gross domestic product. Okay, and the second one is, what is the standard of living? So that is something which we get to know through what we call as purchasing power parity. We'll be discussing about both these concepts in detail in the following sections. So let's proceed. To dig deeper into the health of an economy, economists look at three basic variables, that is the output growth, the unemployment rate, and the inflation rate. What does these mean? Output growth basically implies the rate of change in output, which is implied by its GDP. The unemployment rate, it's the proportion of workers in an economy who are not employed but are looking for work. Okay, that is referred to as the unemployment rate. Generally, it's given in percentage. Then the inflation rate, which generally remains the center of policy concern or debates, okay, is again the rate at which average price of goods in the economy is increasing over time. So the price rise, which we generally encounter as an issue, that is what the inflation rate implies. Now the table below provides a summary of these three different measures in United States between the period 1990 to 2021. And you can observe there have been episodes of increasing and decreasing output growth, right? Initially it was 3% between the period 1990 to 2007. Then it declined to negative 1.3% specifically in the year of global financial crisis. Then again there was a rebound, and then eventually had been increasing until this year, when the year 2020, when there was again a steep decline. Likewise, the unemployment rate, it has been increasing till 2008-9, and then there was a decline up till 2018, and with the pandemic coming in 2020, it had increased to 9.2% by the end of 2021. For the inflation, if we look, it had been around 2.3% in 1990 to 2007 period, while in 2008-9 it was 1.3%. Then again there has been a continuous increase over the years up till 2021, when it was 6.8%. So broadly we can observe that the US economy seemed to be in a very good shape, having largely left the effects of financial crisis behind until the pandemic came in and the numbers again deteriorated. If we are to summarize the major macroeconomic problems faced by any economy or per se USA, number one, it's the short run perspective, where namely whether they are able to handle the recessions is a key concern. Okay, so the short run problem comprises of addressing the episode of recession. Now, in long run, the question is to how to go about increasing the productivity growth. Okay, so that is something which remains as a challenge to the policymakers in long run. So let's look at both sides in turn, that is recession in short run and productivity growth in long run. The key question in short run for the policymakers is to identify whether there are necessary tools available to handle the current recession. If we look historically, the recovery from the financial crisis, which started in US around 2009, since then the output growth had been positive, okay, and it continued to expand for 128 months, which was longest since 1945. And until then, even before the pandemic, it was obvious that such long expansion at some point would be stopped, okay? And the next recession might have been triggered by either a trade war leading, for example, to sharp decline in exports, or may have been due to uncertainty leading people to consume less and firms to invest less, or from another financial crisis despite the measures that have been taken since 2007-8 to decrease the risk in the global financial system. Eventually, as has happened many times in the past, what stopped growth was even nobody could had anticipated, right? So COVID-19 was something which was beyond imagination, and what it led to was the complete shutdown of productive activity and soaring unemployment levels. And to be more precise, the numbers were like 14.7 in April from 4.4% in March in terms of growth in unemployment. Now the question is, what policymakers can do to limit the decline in output? The answer lies with the role of the central bank. This is where the role of central banks like Federal Reserve or any other economy central bank comes into play, because central banks are the bodies which are mandated to fight recessions. Okay, they are vested with the power by the governments to fight recessions. Now there are two prime reasons that why they ideally are suited for fighting recessions. Number one, because part of their mandate is to fight recessions. Number two, because it has the best policy instruments to do so, that is controlling the interest rate. Okay, and by decreasing the interest rate, what the central banks can do is to stimulate demand, which increases output and decreases unemployment. And by increasing the interest rate, it can slow down the demand and increase unemployment. Now, as shown in the figure, okay, after the pandemic, which hit the entire world, specifically in case of USA, if we see, the Fed intervened rapidly, reducing the policy interest rate from 2.5 to 0.5%, and the markets expected it to stay close to zero for more than 2 years. Okay, and note that in both 2008 and 2020, the reduction in the policy rate was accompanied by corresponding reduction in the rate expected for the following years, as shown by the dashed lines of figure. So the problem faced by the Fed today is that the starting point is lower than it was in 2008, and thus there is a very limited room to decrease or cut the interest rates. Now in 2008, the Fed decreased the interest rate from 5.3 in July 2008 to close to 0% in December 2008, and the rate remained close to zero until the end of 2015. Now today, the space for the Fed to reduce the interest rates is even more smaller, that is 2.5% instead of 5.3%, right? So why did the Fed stop at zero both in 2008 and 2020? This is again an interesting question. Why did the Fed stop at zero both in 2008 and in 2020? Why did it not go beyond that? Now the Fed would have liked to decrease the interest rate further, which is more negative, but it would not. Why? Because the interest rate cannot be negative. If it were, then nobody would hold bonds. Nobody will be willing to save. Everybody would want to hold cash instead, because cash pays a zero interest rate, while bonds would pay a negative interest rate. And this constraint is known as the zero lower bound, a limit that the Fed hit both in 2008 and in 2020. Japan is again a classic example to study the cases of zero lower bound. Now, are there other tools that the Fed could use? Can fiscal policy help? The answer to both these questions, as we shall see later in this discussion, okay, will be a yes. But whether these other tools will be enough is far from certain, okay? And this is why many economists are worried that policy may not do enough to offset the consequences of pandemic on an economy. We have so far discussed that in short run, it's the interplay of demand and the central bank decisions which drive the economic outcomes. Now let us shift our focus to understand how worrisome is long-term productivity growth to get a long-term perspective. Okay, in long run, as stated earlier, that productivity growth is one of the crucial factor. Okay, so taking the case of United States, let us see that how productivity growth matter and why it is something which we should be worried about. Productivity growth varies a lot from year to year, and some economists believe that it may be just few bad years and not much to worry about. Others believe that measurement issues make it difficult to measure output and that productivity growth may be underestimated. Now, for example, how do we measure the productivity of a new smartphone relative to an older model? For the same price as an older model, it does many new things that the older model could not do. Or if we see it other way, it is much more productive and we may not be very good at measuring the improvement in productivity. Yet others believe that United States has truly entered a period of lower productivity growth, that the major gains from current innovation in information technology may already have been obtained and the progress is likely to be less rapid, at least for some time. One particular reason to worry about the productivity growth slowing down is happening in the context of inequality. Inequality, even if it increases, okay, when productivity growth is high, most are likely to benefit, even if the inequality is going to go up. The poor may benefit less than the rich, but they see their standard of living increasing. So this is how productivity growth plays an important role, and this is not only the case with United States only, it holds for rest of the world as well. Since 2000, the real earnings of the worker at a high school education or less have actually decreased. Now, if policymakers want to invert this trend, they need to either raise productivity growth or limit the rise in inequality or both. Now, these are the major challenges which are confronted by the US today. The EU and the Euro area. In 1957, six nations decided to form a common European market, which is known as the special economic zone, okay, where trade of goods and services can take place freely. And over time, there are 22 countries which joined this and bringing the total to 28. And more recently, the UK had decided to exit, which had joined in 1973, while the negotiations are still going on, the famous debate over the Brexit. Okay, and notably in 1999 in this area, the countries member nations decided to have a common currency. Okay, and 11 nations participated initially and then 8 more joined, and this common currency area came to be known as Euro area. The key issues in this area are unemployment and efficiency in common currency areas. You can get into more details by searching articles related to same on the Euro area. There are ample amount of research articles and other studies available if you would be interested to explore more. There are advantages of having a common currency area, but at the same time there are several issues as well. For instance, there may be some economies which need some dedicated approach in terms of the policy, but because it's going to be a common currency area, okay, so any policy intervention is going to have an equal impact on all the economies, right? But it may be the case that some of the economies don't need any such intervention, right? So state specific policy measures are something which always remains as a challenge for these European member nations, because one size fits for all may not serve the purpose for everyone. The next economy which we are going to discuss is China, and you would have noticed over the years China has received much of the world's attention, And primarily this is because China's output based on purchasing power parity is $25.3 trillion, which is even higher than United States of America. What it means is that given fixed income, what you can buy in US, for example, with $1,000 will be less than what you can get in China for same $1,000. And this is simply because in an advanced developed economy, the cost of living or the cost of goods or consumption commodities, it's always going to be higher as compared to their emerging market counterparts. Hence, the purchasing power parity is going to be higher in case of China. And China has been growing very rapidly for more than 3 decades with a record high rate of capital accumulation, that is 46%. And similar thing in case of US stands at 21% only. And this implies this economy is witnessing higher productivity, hence higher growth. Okay. But what are the challenges this economy is confronted with today? If you look at the table, broadly the 3 major indicators which we had highlighted, that is output, unemployment and inflation, are summarized with their movements over the years. But the broad challenges which are encountered by the Chinese economy are transition from investment to consumption driven economy. Over the years, the Chinese economy, their industrialization has been very rapid. The investment has been at a very large scale. But today, they are facing the bottlenecks in terms of consumption. So the economy wants that the consumption expenditure should go up. Okay. And this is something which remains as an issue for the policymakers going forward. You may be wondering what difference will consumption expenditure will make in an economy when they already have investments. Why can't their economy boom further? Okay. But answer to these questions we'll be taking up in the upcoming chapters. Like the economies we have discussed so far, there are various other economies from which we can take up different macroeconomic issues which can be looked upon. For instance, the case of India, which is a large country like China and is now emerging as the fastest growing economy in the world. Japan, for instance, whose growth performance has been termed as a miracle post World War II, which continuously grew for like 40 years. But more recently, if we see the past 2 decades, it has been suffering from prolonged recession with the growth figures clocking around approximately 1% per year. Latin America, for instance, which went from high inflation to low inflation zone in 1990s and then sustained strong growth. And more recently, however, its growth has slowed, but as a result, in part of a decline in the price of commodities. Central and Eastern Europe could be looked upon, which shifted from central planning to market system in early 1990s. In most countries, the shift was characterized by a sharp decline in output at the start of transition. And since then, however, most countries have achieved high growth rates and are catching up with the Western Europe. Sub-Saharan Africa can be looked upon as another interesting case where decades of economic stagnation was there. Contrary to common perceptions, growth has been high since 2000, averaging around 5% per year, and reflecting growth in most of the countries of the continent. Okay. Moreover, so far, Africa seems to have escaped the worst of COVID-19 pandemic, if we look at the ongoing scenario. The broad goal of this chapter was to highlight the major macroeconomic issues confronted by different economies across the world today. And in the next chapter, what we are going to look into is 3 main macroeconomic indicators, how they are measured, that is output, unemployment rate, and the inflation rate. These are the central macroeconomic variables which we will be looking into and understand their implications when we are trying to assess an economy. If you like the content of our videos and want us to contribute more, you can support our channel by subscribing to it and following us on social media platforms. Thank you and have a good day.